So yes, so I'm coming to you from Montreal, which has long been a meeting place of many First Nations, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm one of the many different people who have been here over time, and it remains a melting pot of very many different people. So I'd like to acknowledge that. So yes, the presentation really is to give you a potted summary of the latest report, Irreversible Extreme Heat, Protecting Canadians and Communities from a Lethal Future. And I really want to kind of convey the openness to your feedback as well from the report, because we want this report to be used as the primary kind of objective. So any feedback that you have would be gratefully received. So in terms of the agenda, I'm going to cover kind of four main sections. Firstly, why we need to adapt to extreme heat in Canada. Overview of extreme heat projections for Canada. So that's the kind of the first parts of the report. And then I'll be focusing after we've covered that on the actions to reduce risk, which is the main body of this report. It's really a solutions-based report. That's going to be a key focus. And then lastly, on achieving multiple benefits, which is really, drawing on the fact that we can reduce extreme heat and achieve other things at the same time with the same actions. The presentation is on new national guidance. It was launched just last week, so it's hot off the press. I've included the link here, and the presentation will be circulated after with the recording. So there's many links throughout the presentation, so I would really encourage you to look through after and click on some of those for further information. Obviously, I would encourage you to read the report. And it's not a report that I've written kind of in isolation. It's very much a compilation of a lot of national experts, which I see many names here on the webinar. So I would like to acknowledge that this wouldn't have been possible without the 65 national experts, including people from NCCEH, who've contributed their expertise, time, and review to the materials. And we're very grateful to NCCEH for also hosting this webinar, and just great to see so many people here. It has been a record-breaking release for the Intech Center on Climate Adaptation, which is a great start, but it's very much a first step, and this is one of our key areas of focus. So we're keen to kind of keep moving with our partners in this space. So to start with the Canadian context, I want to just start at the beginning of what is in store for us in Canada. So Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence. Both past and future warming is about double the magnitude of global warming, and warming is effectively irreversible. So even if we reduce our emissions right now, which we are taking action on, but even if we stopped emitting, we have a certain amount of heat and global warming and extreme weather baked into our future already, and we need to prepare. So in terms of climate impacts, we're looking at more extreme heat and less extreme cold in Canada in particular. That's of relevance to this study. And also intensification of extremes. So we often think of intense rainfall, urban flooding, but this also includes increased severity of heat waves, which is something that I think Canadians may be less aware of, maybe more aware of now since the summer of 2021. But this is one of the extreme events that we expect to be more intense, more frequent in the future. So climate change and climate adaptation is often painted as an environmental issue. And it's really, I think now we are appreciating it as not just an environmental issue, it's very much a social issue and a financial issue. So this graph here represents the insured losses from catastrophic events. And you can see we're around $2 billion in insured losses per year based on the last few years, but most losses are not actually insured. And this is only property damage. So, per $1 of insured losses, there's estimated about $3 to $4 of uninsured losses, which are effectively borne by governments, businesses, and individuals. So that $2 billion is probably more like $8 billion. And I think the interesting thing with the extreme heat is that obviously catastrophic losses are not all financial. So this extract that you see on the slide here is from Aon's 2021 Weather, Climate and Catastrophic Insight report, and it highlights the heat wave in Canada as a catastrophic event with over 800 deaths, but no economic losses or insured losses. So, you know, this is a different character of event than a flood or a fire. You can see the BC floods are here with the losses financially, but you know, four deaths have been documented here. So that we are really dealing with people's lives, and it's very much a health issue. So we have focused on that quite a lot in the report. So it is not just an environmental issue, and obviously there is a lot of research in the health sector in this area. The recent Health of Canadians in a Changing Climate report highlights that climate change is already negatively impacting the health of Canadians, and has been a driver of recent health effects relating to rising temperatures and extreme heat. And I think interestingly also the Canadian Climate Institute's report on the health costs of climate change actually takes those health costs and projects potentially the kind of economic impacts of both heat-related deaths and heat-related productivity losses into the future based on climate projections. And you can see here that the figures at the end of the century, like $8.5 billion, $14.9 billion are high when you compare them to the $2 billion in insured losses that we saw on the previous slide. They are significant. So this is not just an environmental issue. At the Intech Center on Climate Adaptation, we're obviously focused on adaptation, but we are keenly aware that we need to tackle climate change on two fronts, both mitigation to slow down climate change and adaptation to prepare. So adaptation is managing the unavoidable and mitigation is avoiding the unmanageable, but it's not a choice and we must do both. And presently we have extensively focused in Canada on the mitigation side. The federal government issued their emissions reduction plan just recently, and we now really need to focus on adaptation to risks, including extreme heat. At the Intech Center, we have identified 3 key hazards that we work to identify standards and guidance and tools to help people adapt on the ground and prepare Canadians. Those are flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat. And then we also look at the ways in which we can adapt, and that is working with nature, which helps improve also our natural capital. We look at working with capital markets focused on finance, and we also are adding a focus on health going forward. So this very much fits into that. So on to talking about extreme heat. So urban areas are the hotspots of global warming, as highlighted in the recent IPCC 6th assessment report. Extreme heat is identified as a key national issue for Canadian cities and towns in the recent federal government report also. So essentially, in our cities, we have what is called the urban heat island, which are urban areas that are significantly warmer than surrounding areas. And this is related to city geometry, heat from air activity, and the fact that our artificial surfaces really kind of soak up, store, and then re-emit heat more so than vegetated or natural surfaces. So we end up with these, surface temperatures within our cities can be some 10 to 15 degrees hotter than surrounding areas. And particularly at nighttime, it can be something like 12 degrees hotter in a city than in surrounding areas. So we don't necessarily get the opportunity to naturally ventilate our houses or the cooling effect at nighttime in the cities due to the urban heat island effect. And then we have in our cities, we've often kind of destroyed or built on natural infrastructure. So we've depleted vegetation. and depleted water as well. So we often lack water and vegetation, which like encourages the urban heat island effect. So I think this is particularly relevant because around 1 in 7 Canadians actually lives in one of our 35 metropolitan areas. And these are the areas that we've particularly focused on in the report. So in terms of impacts on health, we've called it impacts on health and beyond here. So we have focused on health impacts. Obviously, physical impacts with potential fatalities are top of mind for everybody when we consider the recent deaths of people in British Columbia and then previously in Montreal. But we mustn't neglect the kind of impact of extreme heat also on our mental health and well-being, which is an area of increasing research. And also the impact of extreme heat on the infrastructure on which we depend, for example, particularly electrical power, because electrical power outages can actually be more frequent in extreme heat events because we're asking equipment to operate outside the standard design specifications. So at a time where demand for electricity may be at a peak or is likely to be at a peak if people are using air conditioning, then also that's a period where it's actually less efficient because of the extreme heat is less efficient to distribute the power, and there's a greater likelihood of failure. So we can, if we rely on electricity for our cooling and not kind of alternative means, then we can be more vulnerable to extreme heat events. Extreme heat also affects digital and communications, transportation, rail, such as sun kinks, for example, roads that can bleed and melt, and bridges, and of course our buildings. I think there's a lot of focus on this report on buildings, and also our wider systems. So health and social services are obviously extremely impacted during extreme heat. But also we might think of impacts on our food systems and natural systems. So while we're focused on health, there are wider impacts of extreme heat that we need to consider. So within our cities as well, I think probably a lot of people on this webinar are highly conscious that extreme heat also affects those who are more vulnerable to start with, and can also be an exacerbating factor for inequality. So people who are maybe more exposed to extreme heat may include those people who are living in housing that's poorly adapted, for example, or have mobility issues, or who are socially isolated for other reasons, as well as people who work in the heat or living outdoors, and obviously people who are living in urban heat islands. People may be also more sensitive to extreme heat physiologically. So this may include older adults, pregnant women, people who have pre-existing medical conditions, for example, and also people who have less resources or are living in underserved communities may actually have less kind of resources to help them adapt. So people on lower incomes who are living in underserved communities. So there are a lot of risk factors to take into account in considering how people can adapt or help themselves. And I'm going to switch to looking at the extreme heat indicators that we looked at in this report. And I should say at the top of this that all of the data came from climateatlas.ca. And this is a great resource, and I would really encourage you, if you haven't already, to go and check that out, because it's a really user-friendly way to get a handle on a lot of the different indicators of climate change. And we found it very useful. It's hosted by the Prairie Climate Center, and I found it very good. So we looked at 3 different indicators for this report of extreme heat, the first being the annual number of over 30-degree days, and then secondly, the annual warmest maximum temperature, and the average length of heat waves. So you can see these maps displayed, and I think it becomes particularly clear on looking at the number of 30-degree plus days and length of heat waves that there are kind of 3 areas that are particularly exposed to extreme heat. Obviously, this doesn't include the urban heat island effect, but it's looking at kind of exposure coming from climate. So we can think of areas that are exposed being the valleys between the West Coast and the Rocky Mountains in BC, prairie communities in the south bordering the US, and basically from the Great Lakes down the St. Lawrence River Valley in Ontario and Quebec. So these are also areas where most of Canadians live, and many of our large cities are in these areas. So it's an effect that's going to affect a significant percentage of our population. As part of the report, we particularly looked at the census metropolitan areas of Canada, of which, as I said before, there are 35. And what we did for each of the indicators, we ranked them. So we looked at the top 10 in each of those indicators. And you can see from some of those, the figures that we're coming from, in terms of the number of very hot heat days, we're going from, for example, in Windsor, just over 20 to nearly 80 if we, in a high carbon scenario, by the time we get to 2050 to 2080. And, I think this plays out along each of the indicators. We're talking about potentially significant increases. And, this is what is worrying us and what we need to prepare for. So the purpose of that was really to not just to pick on particular cities, but also focus people on particular areas where we are exposed, but not to say that if we are not located in these areas, we are safe, because obviously I did say that the urban heat island effect is not taking into account in these figures. So even if we are outside these areas, and obviously Vancouver is not featured here, and we obviously did see impacts in 2021. So, this is just areas that are particularly exposed. And in this map, we basically looked at the different CMAs. Those are the ones with the red circles actually represent the populations living in those areas. So you can see that a lot of our key population centers, like it includes Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, Winnipeg, all the way across Canada. So you can see that a lot of these areas are highly populated, but in addition, there are also several smaller communities that are also exposed to these extreme heat conditions, and we also need to be concerned in places that are not metropolitan areas potentially. So that gives a brief overview of the kind of analytical side of the report, which is, to be honest, not the key focus, but what we do want to focus on is the solutions. So the next section of the presentation, I'll be going through some of the actions to reduce risk. So in terms of the actions, the report actually identifies 3 types of action. So those are the non-structural actions, which are based on behavioral change and planning in orange here in this table. Green infrastructure solutions, looking at using vegetation, trees, natural habitats, working with nature in our cities effectively. And then gray infrastructure being actions that are more about building and public infrastructure and how we retrofit or design differently. We have further broke the actions down into the audience. So there is a section for individuals identified by kind of a single person, property owners and managers identified by a person with a building, and then communities. So each of these icons is kind of signposted throughout the report, and you can actually click on the icons to go to a specific table. And I'm going to just walk through some of the tables that we've produced. And the idea is that there is a kind of a one page that for a particular audience, and you can actually explore those actions within the report. So in terms of actions for individuals, one thing that I've been stressing is, everybody can actually make a difference to their own risk and to the risk of their friends and family. And the first action that we identified here was planning with friends and family, particularly those who are more vulnerable than ourselves, on how to help them adapt before an event, and also how to plan in advance to check on them in person, preferably if there is an event. So planning and also assisting people to understand the risks and help them adapt. So that's the first action that everybody can actually take, no matter what their circumstances. We can all kind of talk to our neighbors and their friends and their family. Other actions in the kind of behavioral side are learning to how to use natural ventilation to cool our homes, particularly at night if temperatures allow. Looking at buying energy efficient appliances that give out less heat. For example, light bulbs are a key. We all know if we change our light bulbs to LED, that they give out a lot less heat than the equivalent kind of older models. And also looking here at receiving heat warnings. For example, we can sign up to alerts that alert us when heat waves are going to happen. So that can help raise awareness also. In terms of green infrastructure, you can see here a wonderful balcony with lots of plants and kind of things that are going to offer shade. So I think, even if we don't have a specific garden, we only have a balcony, there are things we can do to help reduce temperatures around the home and shade our homes. If you have the resources and own your own home, you may consider using a green roof, or if that's kind of a step too far, growing a green facade up the side of the roof. So plants actually can help prolong the life of the wall. Contrary to kind of common misconception is that creeping vines damage, but they can actually kind of prolong the life of brickwork and things like that if we choose the right species. In terms of built infrastructure environment, there's a whole load of passive cooling techniques that we can actually use to reduce the heat entering our building. So you can see here kind of exterior shading. Obviously, I recently replaced my windows and I made sure that I chose low heat gain glazing for the windows. We can also install temperature monitors. We can also use fans. And some of the actions that we traditionally think about that actually help with kind of energy efficiency when we're looking at heating. So enhancing insulation, air tightness can actually also help us reduce kind of reduce, if we're using air conditioning, reduce the cooling requirements, but also keep the building cooler in the first place. So yeah. And then at the bottom, I have also, we don't want to kind of completely exclude mechanical cooling, which obviously has a place, particularly when we're looking at vulnerable buildings such as healthcare facilities. So we also can look at using mechanical cooling or heat pumps in our individual. I just actually changed my air conditioner to a heat pump, which was energy efficient. So those actions are also something that at an individual scale. So in terms of the additional advantages that individuals can gain by reducing extreme heat risk through some of the actions I've just described, obviously improve comfort, well-being and mental health. I know that a lot of us have been working at home, and when you're working through extreme heat conditions, it's very difficult to actually work. So I think those, there's a definite level of comfort and well-being. Lower energy bills, for example, if you're maybe also for heating bills, if you're looking at some actions to improve insulation, will help with both. Improved productivity and enhanced property values, particularly if we're looking at using green infrastructure. Often, for example, mature trees can often increase a property value. And also stronger social networks and relationships. So if we are actively engaging with our neighbors and helping people to adapt, then we may benefit from, in other ways from those relationships. I'm going to turn now to property owners and managers. So some of the challenges that are slightly different in multi-unit residential buildings are that many of the buildings may be older infrastructure, not designed for extreme heat. Obviously, that can go for homes also. You can also have higher temperatures on higher floors due to solar radiation, which is a key kind of worry about tower blocks, for example. Limited opportunity for natural ventilation, which was something that I didn't appreciate when I started out doing this report, and I was very grateful for the building science experts who explained why it's difficult to naturally ventilate when you're dealing with different apartments and pressurized hallways, and you cannot just open the window. Reliance on a power supply to operate elevators, provide air conditioning and pump water to up higher floors makes multi-unit residential buildings potentially much more vulnerable to power outages. So if there's a power outage and people cannot get water, cannot use the elevator, and the air conditioning's not working, then that can be a key problem, and we could see more problems and more fatalities in that situation. Often also we have a lot of vulnerable residents who are living in multi-unit residential buildings who are probably tenants, so that's also a key challenge. We also looked at commercial buildings. So some of the specific sensitivities of commercial buildings may include heat sensitive equipment like freezers or laboratories, things like that. They're very sensitive to changes in temperature. A reliance on power supply, obviously, to run the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and often commercial buildings have large sun-exposed parking lots that actually contribute to locally high outdoor temperatures and the heat island effect, and that's something that I'm going to touch on in the actions. So in terms of property owners and managers, we very deliberately termed it property owners rather than building owners, because we want to encourage people to think not just about the building, but around the building, because a lot of the green infrastructure actions that can help shade the building or reduce the urban heat island effect are not actually the building, they're actually the parking lots and the grounds. So that's specific to that terminology. So in terms of non-structural actions, building owners can work to understand their specific vulnerabilities, and that's kind of a behavioral action. They can also help their tenants and their occupants to act. I think landlords have a particular role to play in helping their residents understand the risks and also helping them adapt, and also identifying those who are most vulnerable, who may need additional help, and planning for extreme heat events, so how those vulnerable residents will be assisted or checked on. Again, green infrastructure is similar actions to individual homes, so looking at trees and shading, particularly in parking lots that I mentioned. You can see actually one of the projects that has been undertaken in Quebec by Ville-Éponge, basically kind of making sure that we're increasing vegetation, infiltration, shading in our parking lots, which also obviously helps manage stormwater as well as protecting against extreme heat. We can also look at green roofs. And then particularly for grey infrastructure, many of the actions are similar, but particularly looking at backup power. So extreme heat is not actually classed as a kind of an emergency situation, but if the power is out, then, as I've described, we're not getting water elevated and the air conditioning is not working, then, maintaining backup power can be important if there is a prolonged power outage and people are trapped essentially in their apartment buildings with no respite. So actually Toronto has a suggested protocol for backup power that basically requires 72 hours of power, so that those people who are trapped or in their apartments have like an air-conditioned cool room to go to, for example, in an emergency. Also, along that same line, backup water supply, rather, if the water supply is not working. In terms of property owners and managers, the extra advantages, there's a better experience for tenants with lower operating costs potentially if building is more efficient. A greater chance of avoiding business interruptions, enhanced reputation, which is not something you immediately think about, but I think is important. Improve performance in terms of environmental, social, and governance criteria, additional foot traffic in pedestrian and retail environments, and higher property values and rent premiums. So this is all good news from a real estate point of view. Just briefly on communities, because I know I'm going slightly slower than I promised I would, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So in terms of communities, we're obviously thinking at a more strategic level, but many of the actions remain the same in terms of green infrastructure. There is a lot of focus in communities on maintaining and managing our tree canopy more proactively. So, you know, planting trees and where we've had to fell trees in terms of managing the Eyquem du Frein, making sure we're replacing those trees and that the tree canopy will be maintained into the future. And also expanding vegetation areas, water bodies, and establishing a blue-green network throughout our cities so that we have these kind of cooling corridors where people can shelter, and that also help cool the city and reduce the urban heat island effect. In terms of non-structural measures, many cities are mapping social vulnerability. You can see up at the top the map for Montreal, that they're actually working on the update at the moment. So if we know where our vulnerable populations are, we can make sure that they are adequately addressed in emergency planning. We can also look at kind of communicating with residents and citizens to help them, you know, understand the individual actions so that everybody is pulling in the same direction. We can also, from a grey infrastructure perspective, look at adapting community infrastructure. So the infrastructure risks that I've described at the top, reducing vehicle traffic as well, because the actual using of cars produces heat that exacerbates the heat island effect. So if we can use more active transport and reduce the amount of cars, then that can also be a benefit to our health. Installing cool or reflective pavements or permeable pavements that help water infiltrate and help cool the environment. And also installing kind of artificial shade can also help, you know, as well as tree shading. So those are some of the community measures. Again, additional advantages, in particular reduced greenhouse gas production if we're planting trees that store more carbon, for example, or we're using our cars less, or where we're saving energy, then we can also contribute to net zero targets that many cities have now. Improved air quality with the associated health benefits, carbon sequestration and storage, and improved habitats and biodiversity, obviously, again, linked to green infrastructure usage, which also contributes to kind of control of stormwater and erosion regulation. And many opportunities for recreation and active transport linked with, particularly with also with green infrastructure and active kind of reducing cars. So all of these are essentially making cities a better place to live, as well as making them safer from extreme risk, extreme heat terms. In terms of achieving multiple benefits, I've mentioned a lot of them as we've gone along. I just want to stress that working with nature typically achieves the most additional benefits. We looked at all of the actions and some of the additional benefits that we may see in terms of kind of social network strengthening, recreation, all the ecosystem service co-benefits that we typically don't value in monetary terms, but are of distinct value to our communities, as well as direct financial benefits, for example, longer design life or improved business or work continuity is often, you know, it's worth dollars to businesses as well. So just to stress, natural infrastructure reduces extreme heat and more. I think I've probably gone over that sufficiently, but I found this is a great diagram to explain some of the reasons why. And just to come back to the point that it's not just an environmental issue. So in terms of natural infrastructure, we're actually adding to natural capital, which is kind of the stock of natural assets that we depend on for services. And that's really intrinsically linked to human or social capital and produced capital. There's a kind of a greater recognition that our economy encompasses all three of those capitals. So when we're contributing to natural capital, we're contributing to the economy also. I would like to acknowledge that I did not do this alone. So these are the 65 people who very kindly reviewed the report and put their time, spent a long time with me, pointing me in the right direction, particularly on topics that I knew less about. So I would like to acknowledge their input. And I'd just like to point out some of the user-friendly digital features of the report for those who are going to consult it. So the table in chapter 5 of the report is clickable. So basically you can go to these little kind of the references of the action, and you can actually navigate to that action and then come back to the table using the community building manager or individual icons. So it's designed that you can kind of flip through very easily and navigate between.
But yeah, that's probably out of everything that I've seen.
Okay, someone's not on mute. So hopefully that's made navigation more easy so that people can jump between the actions. And also I've tried to make the reference list more usable for readers. So you will see at the end, all the references are actually arranged with subtitles. So most of, all of the actions have further reading, and the hyperlinks are clickable. So you can easily find out more information, and you can kind of click between the different endnotes. So you can go back and forth between the main report and the references. So just some of the features just to make sure that you realize they were there. I'd just like to end with some of the media highlights. So the report was released last week. The coverage has been very extensive in English and French. And this despite with the fact that we're not in summer yet, and we're releasing the report in advance, and we're not actually in a disaster. So I find that personally very encouraging because, I think everybody has been hammered by the doom and gloom kind of disaster reporting on climate change, and it's refreshing to see coverage of solutions so extensively. The report has been featured on mainstream television, including Radio Canada, CBC, Global National. We've also done extensive radio coverage of kind of a 30-station interview marathon on the Thursday morning after the report was released. Written coverage has also been well above average for the Impact Centre. So we had the Canadian press cover it, which was picked up by hundreds of media outlets, including the Globe and Mail and La Presse. We made the front cover of the Toronto Star and was also featured by CBC Radio Canada. And we've seen a lot of activity also on social media, and we're very grateful to all those partners who took the time to put it in their newsletters, tweet about it, post about it on LinkedIn, because we really want to get the message out of what people can practically do to reduce these risks. I'd just like to draw the attention to the fact that Stephen Gilbo did actually share an article on the report, so that was great. So he has also seen it. So that was very encouraging, and that continues at the moment. We're still doing interviews. I'd just like to highlight this as part of a suite of free tools and guidance that are provided by the Intake Centre. So if you want to go and check out the rest of our resources that are available based on flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat, then and obviously more to come, I invite you to visit our website. And I'm just going to end with a few key messages. Firstly, we need to adapt to extreme heat now, particularly in southern Canadian cities. We can empower residents, building owners and managers and communities to take action to reduce risks. So it's not just something that is one organisation or the government. We actually can have a whole of society approach to work on this together. Want to stress that nature and social networks have a key role to play in increasing our resilience to extreme heat and can be combined with great infrastructure solutions. And there are many win-win opportunities to both reduce risk and make life better. So this is really a positive thing for Canadians, as well as reducing risk and making our cities safer. Thank you very much. And if you would like to ask any questions, I would be very grateful to hear them and any feedback.